All right, you happily miserable accursed, time to get the pod on. This is Curse of Politics, putting the cuss in disgust politically since, about 2019. I'm David Herle. We've got Kory Teneycke here. Jordan Leichnitz is here. And, of course, the ever-loving Scott Reid is here. Today on the show, Alberta goes to the polls. Will it be Smith? Will it be Notley? Which candidate makes for a better ally or more effective target for the federal parties? This is our first pod since David Johnston's no inquiry report and presser. Not sure how much more there is to talk about, but we're determined to butter that fucking thing way past the edge today. Our cursed clipping is Shannon Proudfoot's great piece in the Globe and Mail on the Liberal elite's tone deafness. We'll break down just how dangerous that would be for them, and then Gordon Pinson calls in from somewhere in the cosmos for our Hey Yous. Scott, Jordan, Kory, how the hell are you? Nice weekend?
Yeah. Went and saw Hamilton last night, which is fantastic. I'd watched it on Disney Plus or whatever the hell it's called, and it was great watching it there, but seeing it live is really wonderful.
I've never heard anybody say anything bad about that show, but I've not seen it yet.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. It's really, innovative. But it just, when I see things like that, it reminds me how without talent I am in large sections of life. I can't dance. I can't carry a tin with a bucket. Yeah,
perfect.
no, this is
show business for ugly people.
Yeah,
that's what
they say. And those who can't dance as well, apparently. But
Jordan, that does not apply to you, but it certainly applies.
Well,
it certainly applies to
We
Reid.
all know it does, but that's okay. Thank you for saying so.
I was also immersed in culture. Ode to Billy Joe came on the radio when I was driving this weekend, and I've always been obsessed with this song, and so I did a deep dive on the lyrics, and I'm not yet certain of the form. It's obviously going to be a long read, but I'm going to publish what I think is something of a groundbreaking theory that, as far as I can tell, has never surfaced. But I think that many people are going to be taken aback, because once you hear my theory on what's happening in Ode to Billy Joe, I think you're going to be struck and utterly persuaded. So I'm working on that, and it will be coming to some corner of the internet
Substack?
soon.
That sounds like a Substack.
Maybe. I don't know if there's enough room on the internet for the word count I have in mind. So I may have to move out of the solar system or something. But I'm gonna crack that code.
Right. All right, kids, it's E-Day in Alberta. It's Election Day in Alberta. This is a very, very long day for people working on the central campaign. All your jobs are done. It is what it is.
It's the worst day.
At this point. Jordan, let me start with you. What do you like on days like, what do you like on election days?
God, I like when they're over. It's the worst day because, like, unless you are actually personally running a get out the vote operation, there is literally nothing you can do except just like stew in your anxiety. And I actually, this morning, as a Hill recovery burnout, I try not to feel feelings about campaigns anymore because, we've all had our hearts broken. But like, I woke up with like, that E-Day feeling in the pit of your stomach. Like it's, it's a weird day. And it's a day that, for if you're on the central campaign, most of your colleagues have all been released to local campaigns. If you're feeling particularly useless, you yourself will probably go out and pull the vote for a few hours if you can, as a way to take your mind off everything that's to come. And then obviously when the polls close and the show starts, that's when it all, comes to a head quickly or slowly, depending on the flavor of the campaign. But yeah, it's a weird day. And I think that everybody... And it's just so hard to overstate how exhausted everyone is at this point. Like, you are running on just like nerves and coffee and sleep and, other things that may just get you to the finish line. And you're sort of a shell of a person at this point, just driving towards that poll closing hour.
Oh, fuck. And that, at least it's competitive out there. They've got that to think about.
Yes.
2018, you make me feel bad. I didn't pull any vote in 2018. I was just... sat in my backyard. My sister came out from Regina to make sure I didn't kill myself. Scott came by to check on me, and I just laid tied to the railroad tracks there, smoking gargantuan amounts of weed all day long.
I was glad to have you.
I mean, that's also an option. Don't get me wrong.
I was glad to have you to nurse, because one of the occupational hazards that I've encountered over the years on these days is that I have to be very, very careful to not, because I'm an early riser, to not get up, write the two respective speeches, right? The one that's going to have to be delivered, and the one that you either hope or fear might get delivered. And I
Even if you're not asked
off.
to, you probably have Notley speeches written for.
Yeah, and I knocked those off pretty early. But then I faced an occupational hazard of getting drunk. Right. So I have to find things to do with myself. Sitting around watching a show is not adequate. So I have to ambulate my limbs. I have to have some. Otherwise, I will go to a bar at 11:30 and I will wreck myself. And then come 8:00, you're no goddamn use. And everyone's like, okay, Reid, is he okay? He went on TV and he started talking about the Ode to Billy Joe. I think he's fucked up.
Yeah, as long as you stay off the Twitter, that's
Yeah.
Just uninstall that right now. Just delete it right off your phone, everybody. Nothing good is happening on there today.
So no predictions, because that's a mug's game. But situation seems to be out there that the polling consensus is that the UCP have an advantage, but not so large a one as to rule out the prospect of an NDP win today. So it all comes down to better turnout of NDP voters than of UCP voters if there's going to be a surprise in this election campaign, unless, of course, the NDP have polling in their pocket, as has been the case in the past, that shows something different than what the public pollsters are showing, and they believe in it, and they're acting on it. That might explain the NDP's relatively passive last week. Jordan, what are you seeing out there? What have you seen this past week, and how do you feel going into today?
I feel all the things. Yeah, I think, as we've talked about before, obviously, the path for the NDP is very slim here. It relies on many, many dominoes falling correctly in succession, but it exists. And I think that the turnout that we're seeing in the advance over the last week is a good sign. That turnout is likely to skew New Democrat. And in talking to the campaign, they are feeling good. Their marks are coming out in that. And so they are feeling like the polling consensus, which has, and we could, I think it will be interesting at some point to talk more about polling in this campaign, because it really has been all over the place and each poll has its own strengths and weaknesses. But I'm not sure that any have actually been able to accurately capture what's going on. So they are feeling like the path is very much there. And now it's a knife fight. Like this is where the ground game is hugely important, and they've been investing in that not just for the last month, but for many months and actually even years in key areas like Calgary. And that machine is just in the very highest gear now. So they're going to be pulling those people out to vote today, and we will know pretty soon. I think if it's going to be a UCP victory, that's going to be pretty clear quickly. But if it's going to be for the NDP, it might be a longer night as the results sort of trickle in. But
Kory,
I don't know. I'm feeling like not unoptimistic. I think it's very hard, and I've had my heart broken before, but I'm ready to love again. And I think that they have done in the last week, like what I'm hearing about what they're doing in their ground game. These are all the right things. These are all the things you would do if you knew that your vote was there and just needed to be brought out.
Jordan, I feel like my next question to you should be, how do you feel about your parents? Because it sounds to me as you speak that you are fully emoting. It feels like you are working shit out. It feels like you are in a space. That was a very un-Jordan answer. There was a lot of, I feel this way, but then I think about this and I feel this way and I feel a lot this way.
Yeah, there's a lot of feelings today.
Yeah.
No, you're right.
Yeah.
It's yeah, I mean, and that like this is part and parcel of being New Democrat too, right? Like there's a lot of hope and optimism in our fuel, but powered, we believe in the gospel of the ground game, right? And that's where we make a lot of our wins. And I think that the campaign, everybody I'm talking to, everything I'm hearing there is that they believe that this is possible and that they are doing the right things to get those people to the polling station. And so. Yeah, it's and this is, as I say, this is part of those election day feelings, right? There's not a lot to move that today beyond that operation. So we're going to see really soon.
Kory, can you demystify get out the vote a little bit for us? I mean, I'll just tell you my bias. Listen, there's no saying it's unimportant. If you lose a riding by 2 votes a poll, you could have had it if you'd had a better organization. That's always the case. But when you talk about differential turnout between two parties in a big way, it feels to me like that really can't be accomplished by finding people babysitters and dragging people to the polls. That happens when there is genuinely different enthusiasm levels for one party versus another. And so it's not the machinery of your operation. It is the general motivation of the electorate that yields a big differential turnout. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's important because in these marginal seats, you might be able to move the needle a couple of points, but it's really a couple of points, and it's not in every riding. Every campaign team is going to focus their people in on a handful of ridings where they think it makes the most difference. In this case, largely in Calgary, but running a get out the vote campaign in a strong riding for one party or the other is kind of a wasted effort. It really is the culmination of what the more difficult and laborious portion of get out the vote is, which is voter identification, and having that be of a large enough scale that you've got enough people identified to be able to do it in the first place. That's a really tricky business these days because a lot of people don't pick up their phone. And a lot of this work was done by phone traditionally. It's much harder to do now as a result of just changes in technology. We don't have landlines anymore for the most part. Most people are operating on a cell phone. You can do a lot of work to try to acquire lists, but unlike the traditional terrestrial phone book, it's not tied. That number isn't tied to an address that is easily accessible. So, you're having to take numbers and associate them with individual voters and in the correct riding, et cetera, et cetera. So, the most effective way to ID vote now, and I think it always has been the most effective, but it's most laborious, is canvassing, going door to door. And
that's how I got my start in 1979, knocking on doors.
It can be difficult. Like you really have to have well-trained volunteers because either people want to go to the doorstep and try to persuade people, which I think is a mug's game.
I don't think I've ever been in a campaign that didn't have enough ID'd votes to win, Kory.
Right, they will say, but part of that is it is a bit of a Rorschach test when you go to the doors. Sometimes for some volunteers, they hear what they want to hear, and it's more of a personality test as to whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, et cetera. How you're going to mark down a vote, but
possible liberal,
and also you must toss all your marks if you're canvassing with the candidate.
Yeah, that's right. Like but there are little hints and tips in terms of how you do that effectively. Like, we usually train people to lead with the leader's name, as that's going to be the most instantly identifiable. But if they come back saying, healthcare is the most important issue, and your conservative campaign, I'd mark that down as not voting for me. Like, right. So you got to try to make some judgment calls when you're doing that voter identification. The other thing I think, that has been talked a little bit about in the past on this podcast, but I think it'll be meaningful in this election is the demographic of the voters supporting NDP would lead me to believe that they have an uphill battle.
Age in particular, you're talking about?
Age is the biggest one. It's the biggest. If you were to just look at demographics as to who's going to vote and who isn't over time, over many elections, what is the learning from that? Older voters are more likely to vote. And this is, what generally gives conservatives a couple point advantage when you get to E-Day, because they've had voting day circled on their calendar since the last election, and they've been planning to go out since then. So it's just I can't overstate how big a thing I think that is, and if you're just looking at the data over time as being a big driver. I think where we've seen elections where those numbers have flipped a bit, it would be like 2015, where you saw large numbers of millennials come out to the polls. I think for two reasons. One was Trudeau was able to really animate that demographic with the pledge to legalize marijuana. But the second is that they were actually getting a little bit older. They were moving into these phases of life where you start to be more likely to vote. And And we often just take the rules that are shorthand in our minds around who's going to vote and who isn't, and project them forward, despite the fact that things do change over time. Voting is like reading the New Yorker. It's something you get into when you get older.
Well,
this is your quarterly reminder that elder millennials are now pushing 40.
Made in Canada. How do those three words make you feel, Hurly-Burlyites? Are they just an innocuous place of manufacture on the tab of a t-shirt? Or are they a hell of a lot more meaningful? Let's examine it, and I want to use our presenting sponsor Telus as a case in point. Fast forwarding from 1990, a relatively small Western Canadian company takes a bunch of smart risks, builds, grows, invests some more, in advancing our collective technology capabilities over the next 3 decades, and becomes this world-leading technology company. What's more, they do it all with a laser-like focus on social purpose. Doing good for people is good business, so Telus is embedded in the fabric of our communities, urban and rural, across the nation, and now across other nations too. They launched Telus Health to modernize healthcare and how we can all get better access to it. Telus Agriculture and Consumer Solutions innovates to drive more sustainable food production and delivery. And Telus International, providing IT products and services around the world and driven by the same social purpose, becomes the single largest tech IPO in TSX history. Almost forgot. They also meaningfully fund startups and social enterprise through their Telus Ventures and the Pollinator Fund for Good program. And so what it all adds up to is not only a made in Canada story, although plenty of pride to take in that, Hurly-Burlyites, it's an invests in Canada story. In our R&D, in growing and scaling new business, in innovation, in commercializing and exporting that innovation through IPO, in addressing climate change, and ultimately in driving the long-term growth of the Canadian economy. Telus' aim? Only to continue to invest in a way that helps solve some of our most pressing challenges. If you're a regular listener here, you'll remember what one of our country's leading economists had to say about that. Every business dollar you make and invest back into Canada is good for our economy. Go to telus.com to learn more about all of it. Speaking of demographic trends, though, even if the NDP lose tonight, there is something in the demographics that they should take some joy in. And I've seen polling that indicates that in Calgary, the visible minority vote is overwhelmingly NDP.
That's right. Yeah, huge,
right?
Huge, and
that's the direction that city is heading.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So if the Conservatives can tie the NDP in Calgary tonight, they may not in 8 years be competitive in Calgary.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing is like it's also this is the two-party Alberta is not going anywhere now. This battle is here for a good while, and the demographic trends are very much in the NDP's favor, even if it doesn't come together for them tonight.
Yeah, the other thing that this is a less well-known factor, I think, in terms of what drives voter preference in larger areas is the number of tapas or tasting menus per 100,000. As the city grows and becomes more fancy, it tends to become more progressive. Like, we've seen this. Like I always like the example of Colorado. Like that was a red state. And then it was a purple state. Now it's a pretty solid, predictable blue state. And that's been driven by Denver and the fact that it's gotten bigger and more urban and more fancy. And what is Calgary if not a very similar city in a lot of ways? And I think you're seeing a lot of the same things happen. But as I say, the more people who are going to go for the tasting menu with the wine pairing increases, then so does the progressive vote.
Yeah. That's what makes Saskatchewan and Democrats so sad. No tapas bars.
I know, right?
Yeah, no tapas bars.
It's the root of all the problems there, let me tell you.
Hey, Scott, let me ask you what may seem to be a strange question. Who does Trudeau want to win?
My lower half, I guess. Sorry?
Who does Trudeau want to win tonight?
Well, I think the genuine answer to that is genuinely Rachel Notley. I think that he would probably like to see a progressive win there. And I think that, to the degree to which he's starting to think a lot about legacy and the climate transition, all those legacy issues, I think that he thinks that he would be able to do some work with her. But if he's thinking about raw politics, I'll give him what I think is that Danielle Smith could be just what the doctor ordered for Trudeau.
You run against her in the next federal election.
Well, I don't know I don't know if he carries it that far. I don't know if she carries him that far. But I think that particularly right now, and I was, Kory and I were on Question Period yesterday with Vashi, and we sort of started to get into this a little bit. My view is one of the things that this federal government, that Justin Trudeau personally as a leader requires, is a good enemy, a good fight. And yes, Pierre Poilievre fits the bill for that. But the problem is that that's a hyper-partisanized. He needs someone else to go to the body on Pierre Poilievre when he goes at it like that. But a policy fight and a personal fight and a political fight, something that allows Trudeau to define himself in opposition to someone, that puts him on the right side of the issue, that makes him admirable to the voter coalition that he has and that he aspires to have. And I think that Danielle Smith could do that for him. And I don't think it's around the energy transition. I actually think it's around issues like CPP. And I've mentioned this before, but I'm just going to bang on this drum one more time. She's gone through this campaign with a commitment that once reelected, she will advance on whether or not to withdraw Alberta from the Canada Pension Plan. All the provinces are stewards in that. A bunch of them will have no truck or trade with that. It scares the living bejesus out of most sensible people and most sensible seniors. I think it was a card that should have been played much more aggressively during the campaign by the NDP. And I think that for Trudeau, it puts him in a spot of like real leverage. And I would almost literally tomorrow, if she wins, hold a newser and say, well, listen, I know this issue's dangling around. I'm calling on her right now to abandon the suggestion that she would in any way, shape, or form walk away from the CPP. We're not going to pull on that thread. We don't want the pension, the public pension, the protected public pension sweater that has, kept this country warm and our seniors warm since 1966. We don't want to pull on that thread, and we're against it. And I think that would be good politics for him. And I just think that there's a lot of opportunity for Trudeau. And I also think, by the way, the converse is true. I think that she's a problem for Pierre Poilievre. Pierre Poilievre endorsed her in the last days of the campaign. That makes a lot of sense. I understand why he's doing that. I understand why she wanted that. But I just think she is an unpredictable political commodity. She can take positions either because the raccoons have not moved out. And so, they're going to come. They've been kind of keeping them in the back room, but they're going to be front and center at some point. But in addition to that, she can take positions that are natural for her, an Alberta first position that might make political sense. It might actually be rational. I'm not just talking about her being whack, but that caused him trouble as a national leader and as a national conservative leader. And so I think that I think she represents a double dose of opportunity for Trudeau, which is that if he sets her up to be his his political opposite, that could be very helpful for him. And at the same time, I think she could be a wedge against Poilievre. So, in a lot of ways, I want to see Rachel Notley win. I want to see the NDP win. The partisan in me just can't help. And the person, as I said last week, the person inside of me that's worked in politics 35 years doesn't want someone of Danielle Smith's political character to win. But
Trudeau's interest is 100% clear, you guys. 100% clear. Notley's a problem 100%. For him if she gets elected, because she's going to have to regularly demonstrate her independence from him, regularly demonstrate that she's fighting for Alberta against his interests, and she's friendly fire. That is friendly fire. That just hurts you. That doesn't help you at all. Whereas Smith gives him a whole other front on which to fight, and a way to demonstrate what Poilievre might look like if he actually were to win.
It's a huge
I just think it's all upside.
I think you're optimistic, though, about the ability of the PMO to kind of coalesce around that as a strategy, though, at this point. Like, there would have to be... There would have to be some...
Why the fuck couldn't they? Why? Why not? They want to talk about fucking Chinese interference all day long every day?
There's a template. The Liberals won the 1980 election by running literally against Alberta.
Yeah,
and they consolidated Ontario. Consolidated Ontario 100% behind them. in a fight over energy pricing.
But the instincts of the group of the people around the Prime Minister right now, I think, would not drive towards that.
But there's some more recent example. If you look at the Trudeau-Erin O'Toole campaign, really the final 10 days, what went on, in my view, was a shift of voters away from O'Toole, not through Chinese electoral interference, et cetera, but over pandemic policy and O'Toole being associated with Alberta and Jason Kenney's approach to the pandemic at a point where there's a new wave coming and concerns about pandemic management are peaking. And so there's a relevancy to voters in Ontario and other places, and ones that were uncomfortable with the Kenney approach moved over to Trudeau. And I think so that happened. But if we're going to talk about, debates over the National Energy Program and how that was effective, it's that's about the Prime Minister fighting for lower energy costs in Ontario at the expense of Alberta, and so there is a self-interest there that is clear. That's a very clear line between the two positions. What I think is not good about the CPP debate idea that you're talking about, Scott, is the relevancy isn't there. It's too many dots you have to connect. Like, you're talking about what's going to happen to people's pensions in Alberta, which would be of concern to people in Alberta. It doesn't bother me sitting in Ontario at all what happens with this in Alberta.
Oh, that's the beauty of the issue.
It doesn't change.
You're wrong.
Doesn't change my life.
Kory, you're wrong. You're wrong. Because what's going to happen is they're going to say we actually own a portion of it, and by the way, our proportion is vast in comparison to the rest of the country. It's wildly disproportionate. And they're going to say, therefore, we're taking that out. And the consequence is that in the rest of the country, and this is what's going to drive opposition with her provincial premier, even conservative premier allies.
Nobody in Newfoundland
it's going to drive everybody. Yeah, it's going to drive everybody else's premiums up to try to make for that shortfall. And people are going to say, wait, you're destabilizing this thing that we've built that feels like it's above politics. I think it will freak the shit out of people if they can make the argument, but they got to go out and make it.
I was told the other day that 10% of CPP's investments are in China right now. So maybe you should take a look under the hood a little more closely there to begin with. I'm not sure that's stable. I'm not sure that's a stable approach to investing. But look, I think that there is an opportunity to fight. I think the more damaging thing potentially with the Smith victory for Poilievre is just she's going to be in the headlines a lot more. Spewing things that are maybe not so popular in other parts of the country on a range of issues other than pensions, and a lot of tape of him standing next to her, and a lot of questions probably about. So, what do you think about this latest thing that Danielle Smith has said? And that'll play differently in different parts of the country depending on what the issue is. But I think it's a lot of potential distractions there that are probably not part of the ballot question that the federal Conservatives want to have on people's minds going into the polls.
Supply chains have taken an awful beatdown since the pandemic. They are routinely blamed nowadays for just about every problem in the economy. Delays, product availability, inflation, even labor shortages. It's trendy to blame supply chains. The federal government has now responded. It's establishing a new level of bureaucracy and regulation. The Transportation Supply Chain Office, featured in the last budget. This office, says the government, will collaborate with industry and coordinate action to expand Canadian supply chains and to make them more efficient and reliable. Well, our sponsor, CN, applauds that goal. The railway is existentially crucial to our supply chains, and its long-held view is that they will work optimally only when all participants, all the links, collaborate and coordinate. That's where we should be headed. And that will require transparency. CN already makes more of its internal data public than any other player in the Canadian supply chain. The railway has been relentlessly improving its punctuality and capacity. Throughput, the industry calls it. CN trains leave on time and arrive on time and set records for moving grain out of the prairies this past season. So, if the new Federal Supply Chain Office intends to collect data from all the participants in the supply chains, no exceptions, and then offer solutions based on that data, bravo, bravissimo. But that will mean much greater disclosure all the way along the line. Shippers, producers, manufacturers, trucking companies, everyone, not just the railways. If the new supply chain office can accomplish that, it will be doing a service for the economy. CN wishes it well. All right, let's move on, because we'll have more to say about this when we've actually got results to talk about. So we'll be taking this apart in some detail next week.
By the way, if we look at last week as a precedent, David, this means that Notley wins. Because last week we all sat here and said that, Johnson would recommend a public inquiry, and hours later he did not.
Right.
So we're brilliant and insightful, Scott.
So let's move on to a great clipping by Shannon Proudfoot in the Globe and Mail, where she really found a fresh angle on the Johnson Chinese inquiry option. Let's have a few snippets of it here. There's something else in Mr. Johnson's explanation that might stop you short. It seems to take for granted that ski chalets, friendships with former and future prime ministers, relationships chill enough for, hey, can I leave my car at your place in Tremblant? And everything else that goes along with the story are common, unremarkable occurrences for ordinary people. And of course they are not. This is about what starts to seem so normal that you don't see it anymore or realize that it's wildly abnormal for most of the people listening to you, especially if you're a public figure working on behalf of those people. It's about who should be asking themselves the question, is it just me? The Liberals, to be fair, have produced some howlers. Bill Morneau, the former finance minister, managed to more or less lose a French villa between his couch cushions when he failed to properly disclose the vacation property due to administrative confusion. On the Conservative side, this weird blindness has lately taken the form of claiming humble origins as a competitive sport, which is just as tone-deaf as oblivious privilege, with bonus points for being hypocritical too. Mr. Poilievre incessantly bangs the drum of anti-elitism and respect for common people without ever acknowledging that he's been pulling down a six-figure salary on the public dime since he was 24 and qualified for a guaranteed pension at the decrepit age of 31. But over the past year or two, it's become very obvious that there is, seething just under the surface in this country, a combustible, pressurized vein of certainty that some people count while others don't. Plenty of Canadians believe, some with good reason, others without, that the people running the show fundamentally aren't like them, don't understand, and maybe can't even see them. Staying alive to that reality and where you fall within it, matters a whole lot more if the elite job you occupy is politics. Now, Scott, you were very taken with this column by Shannon. What interests you about it?
Well, I just think that it's a really great insight, and I think there's two deep halves of it to explore. I do think, there are things that define a political party and a government in particular after it's been together for a while. And I think the modern Liberal Party is really heavily defined around the issue of climate. I think that's fundamentally becoming the core sort of issue that drives the government and its worldview. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can have a point of view one way or the other. And then I think there is this sort of managerial, professional class mentality. And it can move into this unconscious elitism. And, I always say, don't be what your opponent says you are. And maybe these leopards can't change their spots, but maybe they should be able to spot their spots. And I think, this kind of attitude seeps out of them, and they got to be conscious of it. I think Shannon has done a huge service to the Trudeau group, because there is this, there's not just a reflex to talk in this way, but then there's a sureness about being called on it. I'm certain that many of the reactions to this column was outrage. Why? Surely to God, there are other people who have a fully functioning kitchen in their boathouse. And I can't be the only person to have ever served in government who, has an original art collection. So just shut the fuck up. Is that so disqualifying? There's just that, and so I think that's really important. It's a really important impulse to check. I think that we all become blind to our prejudices, and I think that she's done them a real service in checking that. And I can tell you, it's a tone and a sound that bugs me sometimes as well. But I also think the Poilievre part of it is super interesting, because I was actually chatting with Shannon about this column, and she had a great line to me off the record where she said, or, just the two of us, and she said, she characterized what she just described in the column from Polyev as working class cosplay. And there is working class cosplay coming off the guy, right? Like there's this, we struggle, and there's something interesting there about the venom. Right. There's a genuine motivated anger, like a distrust, a resentment, a real resentment that comes from Polyev. And it's not just cynicism. He isn't just channeling, the convoy anger. Like there's a genuine personal something in that guy's hard wiring where he's like, all these fucking people, who were born with, memberships to the Granite Club. I'm going to burn those fuckers. And that is also a weakness. And he's got to be really careful, not just that he can look like a hypocrite, but that he can look like a mean-spirited prick. Yeah. And I just think so on both sides, this thing, we're getting into kind of, political psychology. We're getting into sort of pseudo-psychological demography. But boy, there's interesting shit going on there. And there's a lot of traps for both sides.
I actually think that Polyev comes by his outsider positioning, honestly. And I think it's probably impossible to understand that guy without really understanding what high school was like for him.
Yeah, I think the origin story is telling.
I think a lot of it goes back to that. But let's not let the liberal side of this equation off the hook. It is the case that all over the world, and Jordan, you would know this better than I, but whether it's Macron's government or whether it's the Democrats in the States or whether it's the Liberal Party in Canada, liberal parties now represent the managerial professional class of society. Not the rich people, not the Bezoses and that group, but the people that service those people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right?
And I think I would add on to Scott's analysis, because I agree. And I usually, I make a note after I read the clipping every week. And the only thing I wrote down after reading Shannon's piece was yes in all caps. This is like a cri de coeur, right? She really, I think, captured so many of the problems. And Scott's analysis has explained why. And I would just add one thing to it for the liberal piece. And I think that the part of the attitude that is so very dangerous for the liberals on this is the idea of virtue, right? That they know better, that their way of living and being and their values and the issues that they forefront are better than other people's. And I think that that nut is the toxic thing at the heart of this attitude that could eventually eat them. Because I think a lot of Canadians, for example, can agree or disagree that climate change is the most important issue facing us. But it's not a value neutral discussion that's happening right now. When the Liberals speak about it, and of course, our very favorite friend, Minister Guilbeault, I think, epitomizes this. It's as though he is also passing judgment on people who don't share that as the top priority, and on a way of life, and on entire parts of the country. And that's what's deadly, because it moves it outside of the realm of any kind of a policy discussion and into a question of who people are and whether they're good or not. And this is just not a good ground. And the other thing I want to say about the piece touching on Pierre Polyev, and, at the risk of indulging in a little bit more pop psychology, and I do think that Polyev's origin story as an outsider is real, but he's more of a social outsider than a class insider, right? Or outsider. And I think that also really inflects how he talks about working class people. Because if you listen to him talk about working class people, it's somebody who's talking about a conceptual idea of working class people, and also only a certain type of working class people, only white blue collar men, right? He's not talking about an immigrant woman who's in the service industry very clearly when he's idealizing the working class.
I'll be honest, I think that's fairer about gender than it is about visible minority. I actually do see lots of Vismans in his
Well, I'm not saying that,
but I think his conception of working class is men with a hammer. That is for sure.
Yes, that's it. I think when he talks about it, when you listen to his speeches where he's really getting deep into the cosplay, if you will, he's painting a very specific picture. And I think
man wings and he shall fly.
Yeah, there we go. This is
Man,
some of
he's
it
gonna
is
be a
deep,
man.
Some of it is deep in the subreddits, you know. And that stuff is not like, it's not, I don't think it doesn't do anything to help him connect with people. I think in fact it makes him look more distant in a lot of ways, and it does harden some of those negatives about his inability to connect, especially with women. And so indulging in that overmuch is a wrong choice, I think, for his team. But they are doubling down on it, and that may come back to bite them unless they're able to shift that tone.
Hey, Kory, like me, you're a farm boy that now drives sports cars to tapas bars. What do you think about this?
Well, first of all, I think the new Corvette is a wonderful car. Highly recommend. Much better than the Ferrari I had previously. Less time in the shop, but
also more of a social outsider. Really, Kory's more less class. Really.
Yeah. So anyway, having established my credentials. Look, I see the same thing. There is a risk, and it's not unique, I think, to these parties, as you pointed out. It kind of exists in politics as you look across the country and around the world. That there is a risk there. There's always a risk, but I think there are ways of combating that for both of these parties and party leaders. A lot of it can be done through visuals, I think, and being very cognizant. Like if I were Poilievre, I'd get out of the suit a little bit more. I would take the opportunity this summer on touring around to really be seen with those voters that he's trying to reach out to, who are a little more working class, in ways that drive visuals that are more authentic. And I think if you're Trudeau, and the Trudeau government, you got to be really careful about the chumminess with elites, and that's in a whole range of things. Like it's this is really what I think has been damaging about the Johnston stuff. Is that as just why it's the clipping you chose, but it's not like that's the only appointment or highly visible thing of that nature that the government's going to have to do between now and the next election. Maybe try with Senate appointments or something to pick some people who aren't part of the Granite Club, who aren't chums of yours. Do some things to demonstrate that it's not a closed club for people that aren't like me, right?
Yeah, kind of funny that this is such an even-handed conversation about, well, the Liberals this and the Conservatives that. Because the fact is, we're living in a populist age. We're living in a time when deference to experts and elites is weak, and when people demand their own evidence of things. And what we're talking about here is conservatives who understand this but are clumsily trying to reach out for it, versus liberals who don't appear to understand it at all. That's a much graver thing. And where do the NDP fit into this conversation? They're supposed to be the working class people. But they're also a bunch of elite technocrats, right?
Well, I don't think that that's really the case. I mean, we talked a little bit over the weekend. We were chatting about Charlie Angus's recent video.
Welcome to Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, the Ottawa edition. And on this episode, we're visiting Rockcliffe. This is one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the country. This is where the old money, the big money, and where Pierre Poilievre have their digs. Now, Mr. Poilievre already has a house in Ottawa, but by moving into Rockcliffe, he gets a 19-room mansion, servants, a personal chef, and $170,000 a year in upkeep for the joint. Talk about gatekeepers. This guy's got groundskeepers. Now, personally, I don't have a problem with an official residence for the leader of the opposition, but I do have a problem with Pierre Poilievre telling senior citizens that they don't deserve to have access to free public dental care while he's being served Eggs Benedict from his own personal chef in his own mansion paid for by the taxpayer. Pierre, enough with the champagne and caviar dreams. Please.
That energy is exactly the right place for New Democrats to be. Like, they both at a personal level in terms of their members, their candidates, their people genuinely have stories to tell about coming from regular people roots and doing this work. And I would say that in my experience working with New Democrats, the caucus as a whole typically has a lot more self-discipline when there's a tendency to stray into territory that might be a little bit out of touch with actual things. There is an internal pull back to, okay, guys, we got to be real about what people are actually living on this. And I think that some of that comes from the fact that New Democrats genuinely represent seats all across the country in places where Liberals do no longer have seats that are very working class. And that brings a certain honesty around the caucus table that keeps people, alive to that reality. I think obviously Singh has some challenges in executing that through his leadership because of his appearance, because of how he dresses.
What's with that? Let me just stop you right there.
Yeah.
Let me just put you on the spot. What the fuck is with an NDP leader in three-piece suits and a goddamn Rolex?
Yeah. Well, he's actually, and he's talked about this. And I think that...
I know he has. And I know it's personal to him, blah, 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 but whatever.
Well,
There's a conceit.
the reason that he dresses as he does, and this is his telling of it, is as he was growing up, he experienced a lot of racism. And as he was going through law school and trying to really find his own way in spaces that were more elite, dressing like this it's a form of armor for him. And that's how he presents himself to the world to overcome some of those biases that he's encountered. And, I can't pass judgment on that piece of it. That's not my lived experience, right? I do think it does present some political challenges for a party of the working class to have a leader that dresses that way. But as a political strategist on the flip side of the coin, I could never recommend that he alter something that is fundamental to how he feels comfortable interacting in a leadership role in the world. It wouldn't ring true, right? So I think that's
but this doesn't ring true either.
It looks like a costume more than it does like his natural self. Like I don't, and maybe that's when you're talking about him saying it's like putting on armor. Well, it's not like that as his natural self. Like that's something that you're putting on for a reason, but it's, I don't know. There is an inauthenticity about it, I think as well. It's, maybe deliberately so, but it's certainly from a political standpoint, it's putting a barrier between him and the people he wants to have vote for him. And insofar as that, then something that he should maybe be talking to somebody about.
Yeah, I think, and I mean, for sure, this is something his team is always looking at and evaluating, right? But they're alive to that as well. But I also think that it's not really a significant barrier to connecting with Canadians. He continues to have very high favorability across broad sectors of population. So to me, if that were really an issue, we wouldn't be seeing those positive numbers. So I think sometimes it gets made a little bit more significant by folks like us than it.
No, but I don't mean to
pile.
I'm not piling on. I'm not piling on because you're right. It isn't. I think things aren't going disastrously. The party isn't collapsing in the polls. It's blah blah blah. But
more than that, Singh is a strong asset for the party.
Well, maybe, except that the one thing I don't see is the angry working class rallying around him.
Yeah, but I think that's a different issue. And I think that some of that also has to do with how he speaks about these issues and how he presents himself. And so we see a lot of happy warrior from Singh, right? That's kind of his default way to be. But I think that you are going to need to start to see from him a little bit more anger. He needs to connect with people's anger and maybe like channel that into kind of positive stuff if that's his, way of being. But he does need to reflect back that anger a little bit. And I think that that's a shift that they're going to need to make over the next year. And we may see that.
Yeah. I think he could use a dose of Neil Kinnock for sure. I don't know if he can pull it off. That may be just as much of a costume if you tried to ape that as a three-piece suit. But just quickly on this, just going back, those are challenges for him, I think. And it's true that the working class hero horseshit, if it's revealed as horseshit, is a huge challenge, I think, or could be a potential challenge, a big divot in front of Poilievre. But fundamentally, just like Shannon's column starts and ends with Trudeau, like they're in government. they're trying to win re-election after 4 times in a row. They're the people that are in the window most often. Trudeau is that person. And so I think when it comes to this issue, we can rightly analyze how it creates challenges for all of them. The challenge is particularly pronounced for the Liberals, and they've got to be more alert to it. Certainly, they can't judo it and make it an advantage for themselves against, with Poilievre unless they recognize the weak spot in their own. And I just think that when you've been in government for a long time, sometimes it's even harder to do that because in addition to not seeing it, which is your point earlier, David, the other thing that rises is a defiance, a sense of, go fuck that. I am who I am. I've been prime minister for 7, going on 8, 9, 10 years, and I'm going to be who I am. And you can kiss my ass. And if that means I'm going to go to a World Summit, and afterwards I'm going to have dinner with a bunch of rich people, and I'm going to be photographed doing it, and Pierre Poilievre's going to try to ankle bite me, well, go fuck yourself. I'm not going to let that tail wag this dog. And I can understand how that feels. And I've been in those rooms where leaders will argue that, and the ferocity of that opinion will back off all the aides. But the fundamental insight and observation remains incontrovertible. They've got to be more sensitive to this. They've got to deal with the smug because this, it may have been always around them, but trying to get reelected is going to be harder.
Yeah, they need to bear something in mind. They're going to lose unless something changes. So
yeah.
So, I think the challenge is that there's a group of people within government who feel that they are doing the right things. And I think, to their credit, in many cases, that's true, that they're doing the right things and that purchases them the ability to not listen to these critiques.
Then go work in a bad tasting medicine factory then. But you're trying to get reelected.
All right. Hey, let's give David Johnston the 5 minutes he deserves. He did what at least I did not expect, and rejected a public inquiry in favor of his own inquiry. It has all the legitimacy we would have predicted this process would have. Regardless, if the NDP hang tight with the Liberals, this is the plan. The Liberals think nobody cares out there in the voting population and they can ride this thing out. The NDP seems nervous about that bet to me, and the Conservatives seem to think this is a bigger issue than either the government or most of us do. So, Kory, what's next on this file?
Well, I think more suffering for the Liberals is what's next on this file. It just continues to drag on and on. There isn't an end in sight, and I think the issue is increasingly becoming their management of it, and less about actual Chinese electoral interference or foreign influence in a variety of other ways. So, the lens, I think, is off the Chinese, and it's on the Liberal government in a way that is only making it worse over time. Their handling of it, their dismissal of it, their lack of transparency, the sort of ham-fistedness of the whole thing is really what's driving headlines now more than substantive revelations around the issue itself. So how do they put this together? I don't know whether there's an easy path out at this point. They box themselves in. You can't say, okay, I'm going to follow whatever advice Johnston says and then not do that. But, I think, had they not boxed themselves in that amount, they would have had a bit of an escape valve here by being able to come out and say, all right, we're going to do an inquiry anyway.
They could have done that, Kory. They could have done that. They had easily had the scope to do that because it would have been seen as acting against their interest. I mean, they couldn't, if he'd recommended an inquiry, they couldn't have overruled him. But him not recommending an inquiry, they could have overruled that.
Well, then what are you going to shut down his public hearings? Because he's sort of given himself a new mandate that wasn't a part of the original mandate and is trotted off to do it. And that seems to me to be the worst of all worlds. Like, that's an inquiry without any legitimacy, and it's an invitation to have all the worst parts of an inquiry in terms of an endless stream of visuals and news stories without any of the upshot or upside
of ending it at the end.
Of ending it.
It's like a Jackass movie. It's an invitation to get kicked in the nuts over and over again. It doesn't make any sense at all.
Totally.
Well, but I also think Johnston looked like an elderly man who's well past his best before date. Like, I'm not sure this is a guy you want to have out there, leading this effort. Like, he looked shaky in that press conference, and he looked shaky in some of the interviews he's done. Like, the best performance I thought was the op-ed that he put out in terms of having a clear message. But he fumbled and bumbled and stumbled his way through the press conference, and now he's decided he's going to go and do the same. But look, not everyone is as sharp as they were.
We live in an octogenarian age.
Yeah, well, but look, we've seen, look at the inquiry by the former FBI director into Trump. You can be the head of the FBI and have a great resume, and look like you're suffering from early onset dementia when in front of Congress.
Can I just? I'll be real quick. Two quick thoughts. One, we didn't even want to talk about this. Off mic, we all talked about whether or not we would talk about this week because we're sick and fucking tired of talking about it. And to the government's point, they're betting that everybody's sick and fucking tired of talking about this, that this is just a beltway issue, and therefore the decision to not call the public inquiry is eminently survivable. They'll get to the third week of June, they'll go on break, and they can change the channel, and things will drift away. And yeah, maybe Fife will write a story, but it'll continue to be a limited issue. And they might be right about that. The piece about what they did last week that puzzled me was that they haven't taken Kory's advice that he's tendered over and over and over again since this whole thing started. Do stuff. I was shocked about how passive their response was. Knowing that you were going to accept a recommendation not have an inquiry, why didn't they then have an announcement where they said, but by the way, here's their 5-point plan. This is the action plan, not the not action plan. This is the fucking taking action plan. Here's 5 things. Here's the foreign registry, the date that it's going to be tabled. Here's what else we're doing. Police stations, we've just announced that there's going to be a special unit that's going to go into them and they're going to, and bang, 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 cyber patrols, because it isn't just China. We got to be very alert to what's happening, with other countries that are trying to interfere, particularly Russia, and on and on. I was surprised they didn't have, after this has been going on since February. Is nobody writing a fucking memo for minister to make recommendations on here's an integrated 4, 5, 6-point plan that you might be able to put in public that could activate change? The idea that they're going to say, well, I want to wait and hear what Johnson's hearings produce so that we can then get his recommendations on that in the fall, and then maybe we'll do it? Come on.
It's drawing out the pain. Yeah, I think it's interesting too. It seems to me that they maybe are making the mistake of thinking that because their opponents are proposing some of these solutions that they shouldn't do them lest it give credibility to their opponents. But I think that's exactly the wrong approach. Your better bet is to drown this and get your arms around it with some actual content. Whatever you can do to pull yourself out of that reactive phase. And so for whatever reason, they haven't been able to do that, or they're choosing not to. But I think it's a big mistake. And to echo what Kory said, 100% this is the worst of all worlds. You are not getting the credibility of an inquiry, but you're getting the long, painful airing of everything that's out of your control that you would. So I think that the greatest proof that the PMO wasn't involved really in the drafting of this report is the fact that Johnston was allowed to appoint himself to this. It is so blindingly unself-aware that that could have only come from somebody who has been away from politics for many, many years. And the other thing I want to highlight 2 things that haven't been touched on, and then we can just stop talking about this because I am also bored of it. But the report was actually quite damning as well on issues of basic competence within how our political leaders and how this government specifically is receiving intelligence. And I think that shouldn't get lost in the shuffle, that there is...
Those were his justifications for why the political level is not accountable.
Right. But...
Right, because of
if only someone were in charge.
The system's so fucked, you can't blame the people in charge of the system.
So I think there's
it's the people who are next to the people who are in charge of the system that really ought to be.
I mean, I'm not
I get
someone
that, actually.
who
It sounds
spent
crazy,
2
but I
months
get that.
becoming an expert, but this seems problematic to me. And I see echoes also of what the Rouleau Commission found, right? Which is that basically everything is siloed and no one can actually action stuff. So if your best defense is, well, our system is internally incompetent, that's not good.
We need to stop looking at the government closely or we'll lose confidence in the government.
Exactly. So I would also say that I think that even though this report, the immediate political risk of it is just the government's poor management of it, there is also a longer term risk there that goes to just the fact that apparently things are not working. And the other thing I'll say that I think is interesting, what New Democrats are up to. So Poilievre, and maybe
oh,
we can
sure, you
this
think that's
later.
interesting?
Yeah, I do think but so Poilievre is choosing not to get the clearance to have access to this information, which I think politically is probably very on brand for him, and I don't know that it's a bad move necessarily, but it has allowed
I think it's what I would recommend.
Sing some space to try to step up and be the adult in the room. And it's interesting because the New Democrats have really stayed away from this story so far. So they are kind of experimenting with taking up a bit of that leader of the opposition space, is remaining very critical of the government, but trying to go in there. So I'm interested to see if they're successful in using that as an opportunity to help get a little bit more credibility for Singh. That's something that's it's a serious issue, and he's sort of treating it seriously when Poilievre isn't. So we'll see if that pays off for them.
Can I just say one other point that around this in terms of their response? Like, the only action item that really made any news coming out of this was the invitation for Han Dong to come back into caucus with the flimsiest of clearance on that. Like, it's like he ruled that the most sensational and unbelievable allegation around advocating for the continued detention of the two Michaels was not true. Okay, what about all the other shit? What about the inappropriate meetings with Chinese diplomatic officials and right? But like, that's the one thing you're going to glom onto and say, oh yeah, well, we're gonna invite him back in. Like, it just seems like absolutely the wrong thing to be putting in the window upon receipt of a report like that. You're not talking about, changes you're going to make with the intelligence community to improve that. You're not talking about, measures that you're going to take to protect individual MPs who are being threatened, or, there's a ton of different roads that you could go down. But the only one you're actually going to talk about
was going to be raised.
is to try to restore the reputation of a guy whose reputation is maybe still in question to anyone who's objective about the facts around this. It's just really putting the emphasis on the wrong part of the storyline, in my view.
All right, kids. I'm all dressed up because I've got to go to a meeting. Baby needs a new pair of shoes. So we got to wrap this thing up. Gordon Pinson, can you summon us to our seats, please?
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
Kory, give us a hey you.
Well, it's on this topic. My hey you is to whoever the CSIS leaker is. Can you please fucking cut it out? If the fact that your oath of office isn't enough, we are all just completely sick and tired of talking about this story every week. So do us all a favor, buddy.
Take the summer off.
Yeah, take the summer off. I'm sure Bob wants to get some time away with his family as well. So, give us a break, please. Thank you.
All right. Jordan?
God bless Rachel Notley and the Alberta NDP team. Bring it home. I know you are so tired. You are all probably so tired and so jazzed, and just do it today. And thank you for your work. We are all with you, those of us without raccoons in our heads.
Scott?
My hey you is to the Prime Minister and the team around him. There's a lot of buzz. Kory and I were chatting about this yesterday on TV about a cabinet shuffle this summer. It's a natural impulse. It's a natural thing to do, and it's probably warranted. But I would just say this, 2 quick warnings. 1, a cabinet shuffle is an awful Ottawa thing to do. And don't overestimate the lease on life that it renews for you. 2nd, there's no cabinet shuffle unless Freeland is moved out of finance. That's just a cold, hard fact. If there's a cabinet shuffle that moves a bunch of other people here or there or changes, right, and Trudeau remains the Prime Minister, Freeland remains the Finance Minister, and the economy remains the number one issue, the cabinet shuffle does not matter. So just don't pretend otherwise. Don't fool yourself into thinking otherwise.
Right. Well, clip and save that one, because that sounds like a future episode where we spend some time on that issue. Of rejigging the cabinet. My hey you goes out to Michael Sabia. News came out last week that he's leaving the Department of Finance to go run Hydro-Quebec and get them to their net zero requirements. Michael Sabia has been in and out of the federal public service over the course of his life, combined with a very distinguished career in the private sector. Super talented person to have been part of the government, and I think we should all be appreciative that he came back and gave 3 years of his life at this point to economic policy at the federal level. So thank you for your service over the years, Michael Sabia. Good luck in Quebec. Okay, that's our show for this week. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, Telus, and our sponsor, CN Rail. All of you hurly-burlyites who watched and listened. My 3 compadres here for being with me to shoot the shit with me this week. Come back next week for more of the Curse of Politics. And in the meantime, God bless Tina Turner. See you later.